Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be giving this presentation today, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak again. I guess I'll just give a brief introduction to myself and who I am. Just like Valerie said, I am the co-founder of the Students Climate Action Network. Unfortunately, I'm not part of it anymore because I'm not in secondary school, but I was recently elected the Associate General Secretary for Somalis for Sustainability and advisor to the Youth Climate Justice Research Project. And I was a youth delegate to COP27 with SCAN and COP29 with UCC. So I guess I'll just give an introduction of how I got here in the first place and how I really got involved in climate. I mean, I started to get involved in climate when I was 12 years old. So it didn't just begin suddenly. I was already interested in the environment. I liked going outside, I liked swimming and all these type of things. And then one of my teachers said, if anybody's interested in anything to do with the environment, come to this room and we'll have a chat about anything to do with the environment. And I was like, sure, like, why not? Why not go ahead? And at this point, I knew kind of about the climate crisis, but it wasn't like the most important thing in my head. I mean, I was 12 years old, first year in secondary school. I had in my head, I had bigger worries. I was like, am I gonna make friends? What am I gonna do? Am I gonna like my teachers? So I went to that classroom anyways, and then that's where I really started learning about the climate crisis. Like not in the way that in it's just like, oh, something's happening in the distant future. No, nothing's, no. I started learning about the climate crisis, intersectionality of the crisis as a whole. And then I felt coming out of that room, low key, quite overwhelmed. I felt quite overwhelmed. I felt a lot of eco anxiety. And I think it was something a lot of my friends felt in that room. And then we were like, you know what? We're all feeling this. We're all young people together. Why not do something? Why not actually mobilize and create something to stop feeling so stressed and overwhelmed right now. So as you can see, a lot of people in the front row of this photo, this was the first climate protest organized in Cork. And this was a couple of days ago, 6 years ago, a couple of days ago. So this was on 2019, on March 15th. And this was organized by 12 to 14-year-olds in a classroom every Wednesday at lunchtime, every Wednesday after school, with the help of our volunteer teachers in SCAN. And we were like, okay, maybe if we're lucky, 300 people will come. And then 5,000 people showed up and we were blown away. I mean, I think only now that I've kind of grown up since I can really appreciate the dystopian nature of it all. I mean, at the moment, I felt proud of all of our work coming to be and like it wasn't a flop, I guess. But now upon reflection, I'm just like, it's not okay for things like this to be happening. It's not okay for so many young people to be leaving their schools, trying to teach their government how to do their job and trying to tell them that take us seriously because our future and our present is at risk. It was the next protest that was September 19th, I think, and this was the biggest one there. And I'll explain kind of how it kind of died down since, but this was the biggest one. I think up to 7,000 or 9,000 people came, and we were again blown away. I mean, like the amount of community and support you can feel in these type of movements is insane. It's beautiful, but it's also, like I said before, quite dystopian to realize how many young people feel the need to leave their schools. And I guess one thing that you can note as well from our previous speaker about how women and girls are on the front lines of these type of things, look on the front lines of this, the majority are women and girls. And a lot of the organizations that I'm part of, a lot of them are mobilized by women and girls. And I think I think a lot of organizations have been noting this, especially now that we're looking at everything's being looked at more with the intersectionality lens rather than just looking at it purely through scientific mediums. I think I'll go briefly through this. I mean, I guess this is my own understanding and definition that I would use in my organizations about climate justice, short and sweet, but I know that our speaker beforehand gave a very in-depth definition, but just look at it as a social, ethical, and political approach to climate change. I mean, the climate justice, we have to acknowledge the wealthiest 10% of the world contribute over 50% of global emissions, but low income communities suffer the most. And I think that climate justice, as opposed to climate action, doesn't just seek to fix the environmentalist kind of lens of the climate crisis, but also seek to address the imbalance by advocating for fair policies and solutions to the climate crisis and seeing how it affects everything. I mean, we can see this. The climate crisis doesn't just, it affects marginalized women and girls more than it would affect the middle class white family, more than it would someone in the global south and all these type of things. I mean, we can see how nuanced and vast the climate crisis is. And on the next slide, we can see how many people are left out of these climate conversations. Women, 80% of climate refugees are women. Indigenous communities, despite them protecting 80% of global biodiversity, you never see them at these global climate conferences. And if you do see them, it's usually in smaller groups. Fortunately, we're seeing a rise in Indigenous communities attending these type of, like the previous speaker said, like COP, which is a UN climate conferences or climate forums, but it's still simply not enough, especially when they're being on the front lines and protecting our planet. We see that low income and disabled populations are not included in climate conversations, or youth activists in the global south, or youth globally. Marginalized groups contribute the least, like I said previously, to climate change, but they suffer the most. And women in particular, in regards to agriculture, face economic losses whilst Indigenous communities lose land and resources. And I mean, then there's a whole conversation about what happens to Pacific Islands when they go underwater, which is going to be the inevitable truth if the climate crisis isn't solved, despite us having solutions. It's just with the honestly, the way that policymakers and government officials are not taking this issue seriously as it is, that's going to be the inevitable truth and the inevitable future. We see Black and Brown communities and Indigenous peoples and low-income groups and disabled individuals continuously left out of these conversations. But then we see mainstream environmentalism historically being dominated by white middle-class perspectives, with the whole slogan of fight for our future. And I mean, this is true. We are fighting for a future, but we have to acknowledge that people right now all over the world are fighting for their now. Before I attended our COP27 on behalf of SCAN, I watched this one video by Vijay Prashad, and he was speaking at the COP26 People's Plenary. And I think that really changed the game for me, and I would really recommend it to anybody. It's just entitled Vijay Prashad COP26 People's Plenary Speech. And he was saying how the slogan fight for a future is middle class and bourgeoisie, and how it doesn't acknowledge the fact that people in the global south are fighting for their present, they're fighting for their now. And how does a slogan like fight for a future sound to a child who hasn't eaten in days, to a family who hasn't seen rain in months, to farmers whose crops have been completely destroyed by the climate crisis? We have to see our privilege, and we have to understand our privilege, especially here in Ireland, that despite we see some effects of the climate crisis, like let's not get that wrong. I mean, we're still seeing unpredictable weather events. We saw last summer the highest record temperature recorded in Phoenix Park, but we have to acknowledge that it's not proportional at all to countries in the global south. And we have to understand, we have to put ourselves into their shoes and see, okay, what can we do here to ensure that frontline communities lead this conversation and recognize how capitalism and colonialism, like how the previous speaker said, how neocolonialism is the systemic root of all this injustice, and how environmental degradation coupled with all of those things are so interconnected. We can see that what is activism, why is it important with regards to climate activism? I mean, it holds leaders to account. That's the most important thing. Like I said previously, all these things are so interconnected, and that's why activism in its entirety is so important, regardless if you're a human rights activist. If you're a human rights activist, you're fighting for women's rights, just by proxy. If you're fighting for women's rights, you're fighting for climate justice, because you're seeing how marginalized women are in regards to this whole thing. If you're fighting for climate justice, you're fighting for disability rights, because you're seeing how they're marginalized in these, and so on and so forth. It's a huge domino effect, and that just shows the intersectionality of this whole issue. And I guess just to touch on kind of a brief COP29 reflection, I mean, it's still quite frustrating. Just like previous speaker said, the countries most responsible for the crisis still act like it's a future problem. They act like it's something that they can keep negotiating on over and over again, rather than addressing it head on. And I mean, my whole family is from Somalia, and I think that just highlights the connection I feel towards this crisis. Because when I was at COP27 just 2 years before this, Somalia was facing the worst drought it had faced in over 12 years. And luckily enough, my family back home were not heavily affected by the crisis, but with an economy dependent on agriculture, I mean, you can put two and two together. And I think knowing this, hearing stories from back home, then being at COP27 in Egypt, hearing other people speak saying, oh, Somalia, we have to help them with this drought that they're facing, but then doing absolutely nothing and spending hours and hours discussing tiny little details like an apostrophe, saying party or parties. It's dystopian it's absurd and it's not okay. I mean, these COP conferences need reform. And then we see them loaning money, like COP27, the Loss and Damage Finance Facility was established, which is a huge milestone for any of these conferences to actually address the neocolonialism or the kind of systemic issue of the climate crisis and how countries in the global south are not equipped with the right resources to actually fight this issue due to colonialism, due to the extraction of all their resources by countries in the global north. So it was a milestone for the Loss and Damage Finance Facility to be established. But then we see nothing being done. And then we see them saying that they're loaning money, telling them that they're helping them recover maybe from a typhoon that hit, or offer aid to Pakistan due to the floods that occurred. But this isn't aid. I think we need to clarify this. This is not a loan. It's simply returning the money that was stolen from them during the years and years and decades of colonialism. And we see with the phrases, I mean, developed world and developing world. It can't get any clearer how systemic this issue is. But then at COP29, which was great, well, it actually wasn't great. I'll actually rephrase. The new global climate finance goal was which developed countries committed to mobilizing at least 300 billion annually by 2035. This was completely inadequate, and it's not okay to actually propose this money when research and scientists were saying that the proposed amount that countries in the global south need is up to 5 trillion, and they downscale this drastically to 300 billion. It's not enough to adequately adapt and mitigate to the climate crisis. And I think that's why this whole kind of conference was about no deal is better than a bad deal, and saying that we need to actually stand up and lobby these politicians for actually proposing such an absurd amount of money towards the countries in the global south, because it's simply not enough to actually mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. How women and girls are at the front lines of the climate impacts, and how female leaders shape global and local environmental policies. They make up 70% of the population living in poverty worldwide. I mean, 80% of people are displaced by climate change are women and girls, like I mentioned before. We can see that there's so many things that you can do to actually adopt an intersectional approach to climate education, and these slides will be shared soon, so please feel free to read them later on. I mean, I think that intersectional policies help tailor solutions to specific communities that require, but they require significant structural and cultural shifts to be effective. To actually teach with a climate justice approach and lens, rather than just seeing it as a complete scientific issue, you need to make sure that you're becoming aware about the whole nuances to do with the climate crisis. And lastly, I can see that a lot of the people here who are watching are in some capacities educated, whether you're working with an NGO or with an organization that helps with educating. I mean, educators have the power to inspire change, not just by teaching, but by setting an example. Whether it's working with younger students or older students, I feel like educators empower learners to appreciate nature and think critically about environmental issues and take meaningful action. I mean, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the educators I had around me in my secondary school, or the fact that I was privileged enough to receive a climate education. And I think that to create a lasting impact, we must not only teach appreciation for nature, but also live it ourselves. And I think I just want to end on how the climate crisis is not a distant threat. I mean, it's happening right now. We see wildfires and floods and heat waves devastate communities internationally. And whilst we may feel insulated in some capacity here in Ireland, it's a privilege that we must recognize. And not everybody has the luxury of waiting. And I think as educators, everybody has a responsibility to empower students, both young and old, but not just with the knowledge, but also with the urgency to act. And true influence comes from action. So if we want students and everybody in our communities to care and take action, we must show them what caring looks like ourselves and lead by example.
Absolutely.
So thank you.